Here we go. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Book Think number 11. And today with me, I have a very special guest, Jimmy Nuts from the Fantasy Nuttwork. And Jimmy, thank you so much for coming on and welcome.
Hey man, I appreciate you inviting me on. I was looking forward to this. I had to reschedule. We were supposed to do it last week. I had to reschedule, unfortunately. Because life. Fun fact though, number 11 was my jersey number in football when I played quarterback. That was my number. I just saw that and I was like, oh
Ah,
yeah, it just kind of
you were
dawned
a
on me.
quarterback. All right. And I was the guy trying to tackle you because I was a defensive tackle.
Well, I got tackled a lot, so you probably would have had great success. I was not very fast. And the offensive line was not very good. So
uh, all right. Cool. Yes. Yes. Number 11 book think today. And so today, Jimmy did us all the favor of picking Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson as our topic of discussion for today. And I'm very happy with that because it is my favorite series ever. And I have read Gardens of the Moon twice now. And you just told me that you are currently reading it for the second time or third.
So the second time, but I've read the first 100 pages of Gardens of the Moon probably 4 times. I really like the Siege of Pale. It's actually one of my favorite events in fantasy. And a lot of it actually has to do with everything that comes like after or down the road, which I'm sure we can talk about. But yeah, I'm technically in my second actual reread. It's really slow. I've been reading it, I'll pick it up, read a chapter, but I have zero schedule for it. It's for me, it's for my
Yeah,
own
sure.
enjoyment. So
Yeah. That's the best way to enjoy it, I think.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to I was gonna show the like this book has an opening epigraph that's kind of like an opening epigraph for like the whole series. And I wanted to show that later on and just go through it a little bit.
Oh yeah.
But for now, um, a little information about Gardens of the Moon. It came out in 1999, and it was so this is 25 years old. This book now, a quarter century old, and so it's been around a while. And I think it's kind of getting into like a different sphere, of like it's almost getting into that realm of becoming a classic, because it's how much time has gone by
Mm.
since it came out, because we speak of classics and we're speaking of like classic 80s literature now, which to me is strange because that's what I grew up with, but but now people think of that 80s stuff as classic fantasy. And so this it's hard to imagine that this has been around for 25 years because so many people on booktube now talk about it. And I find it amazing that it's I think it's entering a different sphere of discussion
Mhm. Yeah,
than
I
what
would agree with that. I mean,
originally yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I was gonna say, I've actually even had somebody recently ask me, "Is A Song of Ice and Fire a classic now in the genre?" And I was like, "I hope not. I hope not yet." Yeah, I was actually gonna, whenever you were bringing it up, it's been around for 25 years, and I'm like, it might be more popular right now than ever before.
Yeah, I think, well, at least amongst people we talk to,
Yeah.
on booktube, it definitely is. I'm not sure about the general public. But yeah, it's popular,
Mhm.
it's funny because I speak to a lot of people at work and stuff like that who don't normally read and they don't hear about it, of course. But
Mhm.
and everybody's heard of Game of Thrones, of course. But uh, so it hasn't gone. It's popular within literary spheres, I think, literature, genre
Yeah.
literature.
Yeah, it's one of those weird things where, yeah, if me and you went down to even Barnes and Noble, right, and asked probably like 10 people just randomly, "Hey, have you read Gardens Made by Steven Erikson?" A few of them, maybe a few have, maybe a few have heard of it, but there's probably a decent amount that haven't. Yet it is sold millions of copies. Right.
Yes.
At least Malazan has as a whole. And then, it's also one of the most remarkable fantasy book deals of all time that Gardens of the Moon spawned for Erikson. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was crazy at the time. I think it was the biggest. I want to say it was the biggest fantasy book deal at that point, but I might be wrong about that. But it was a big deal, and to get a front for 10 very large books
Yeah.
at any point is kind of crazy. So I don't know. It has like an interesting lineage of being a screenplay or being worked on as like a movie at first, and then turning into a book, and just like a really interesting path of actually getting to that point. Which, if you've ever heard Steven Erikson talk, isn't surprising because he's a very interesting guy, and I think that
Yes.
it's only appropriate that his series has taken this path, and will get more and more popular. I think,
Yeah.
whenever you hear someone come in and say, "Hey, I read Wheel of Time, I like fantasy now," or "I read Game of Thrones" or something, that people always want to know what's next, and I certainly think that Malazan fits that bill, and I think for people wanting more, they can go and seek it and find it.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. I think for anybody who's dipped their toe in a genre and read something that they were attracted to it either through like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings movies or what have you,
Mhm.
anyone who's dipped their toe in there, I think um, anyone who is already in it would say, yeah, you might want to venture into this and give it a shot.
Yeah.
So how did you find out about the series?
So it was just a simple thing that kind of what I explained, right? Like when I started my YouTube channel, my whole goal was to find the next A Song of Ice and Fire for myself because I'm like everyone else waiting on Wins a Winner, and it's my favorite series. And I was like, that's what this channel is about. But slowly over time, I realized that that is a fool's errand, and that it is much better to find new favorites for different reasons. And any series, right? You can have inspirations and things like this that, this I can see how this is kind of related to this thing, but like all great series really stand on their own 2 feet and do different things, and I call them pillars of my taste. And what happened was then I started to look for pillars of my taste. I wasn't necessarily
Mhm.
looking for the next Song of Ice and Fire, and
Uh,
I naturally landed at Malazan because people say, hey, you want a challenge? Check this out. And I like challenges. I'm one of those people.
yeah.
I think I said this in my Gardens of the Moon review, but you either get curious or frustrated in life. And I have always fought to be curious because frustration generally does not lead. It can lead to growth, but for me personally, it usually leads to me quitting. So I always try to remain curious. And I knew that this was one of those series that was going to do that for me. And I saw the thread saying it's too confusing and whatever, but I said, I feel like I'm smarter than that. I can do this. And so I went and picked up Gardens of the Moon, and it sat on my shelf for like a year, and I just kept staring at it. I'm like, when am I ready? When is it time? Uh, and one night, I think I had had a couple whiskeys, and I said, you know
Oh,
what? It seems like it's time. And I cracked open
you
those
did
old
the
pages, and it was off to the races. That's the thing, man. Once I read Gardens of the Moon, and that's why in some ways Gardens of the Moon is one of my favorites I like all the books. That's my biggest hot take from Malazan. I actually just love every book. Yeah, I see people, oh, this is a
I
five
agree.
star, this one's a little 2 star. I don't know about this. I love every single second of Malazan. There might have been times where I was more interested in something that, I was waiting for in this book, but like overall, I had just an immensely great time with the series. But Gardens of the Moon is special because it's the intro. I love
Yeah.
beginnings.
Yeah,
And if
sure.
Gardens of the Moon wasn't Gardens of the Moon and written the way it is, I would have never fallen in love. Or maybe, I would have fallen in love in a different way. But like, I don't know, it's just so monumental, so different, but yet has kind of echoes of things that I love, like Dune, for instance. So
Mhm.
Gardens of the Moon is just it has a special place in my heart. Plus, the Siege of Pale is like again one of my favorite scenes with Animander Rake and Moonspawn
Oh,
and everything. I mean, I have a friend who does soundscape audiobooks, and he's done like Lord of the Rings and all these things. Like he's like a sound engineer, and he
okay.
did the Animander Rake section of the audiobook with like ambient sounds and crow. Oh,
Nice.
dude. I wish it was public. There's a whole bunch of copyright stuff with that, but he showed me a sample he was working on. Absolutely insane, like incredible.
Oh, I can imagine that. That'd be awesome.
Mhm.
It's so, because it's so very visual, that
Oh
whole
yeah.
thing, and we'll get to the Siege of Pale, because that's a kind of that's a very big talking point about this book in general.
Oh yeah.
And and I love your terminology, pillars of taste. That's actually a wonderful way to put it.
Better than Pillars of the Earth, am I right? No, I'm just kidding.
I don't know. I haven't read it, but um, all right, cool. So yeah, and you kind of gave us your history. I actually got into this because I was looking for something more along the lines of Donaldson, because that was my main thing. Like, that was my highest example of literature in fantasy that I could remember from,
Mm.
because I read that way back in late 80s, early 90s. And of course I saw his quote on the back of Gardens of the Moon.
Great endorsement, by the way.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I was like, okay, all right. That that's a great, he's my favorite writer, so I gonna have to fall down that path, because I was
Hmm.
so into D&D novels, and I read all the D&D novels, and I was like, but I need something more like Donaldson, and that's how I found Gardens of the Moon. And the funny thing is I looked at it on the bookshelf for like a year, like, just walking by it. Should I get it today? You know? and then, and then because you see a 10-book series, and it's always
Daunting.
intimidating. And
Yeah.
so finally I did, and finally I got it, and I was like, yeah, there's something special here. There's something
Mm.
really special here.
Yeah.
Um, and so uh and I was kind of curious. I wanted to share my screen here, because I want to get your opinion on what you think is the best cover.
Oh man. So here's the fun. First, also, I gotta add this just to make you maybe possibly a little bit jealous. I actually had the great privilege of having dinner with Stephen Donaldson and Steven Erikson at the same time a
Hmm.
couple years back, and obviously Erickson's a great guy. Stephen Donaldson, very
Oh,
funny guy.
he's a riot. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I
very
I
good.
met them. I met them at ICFA last
Oh,
time.
you went to ICFA? Yeah, that's where I met
I
him.
did. Yep.
Well, how am I supposed to sound cool if we've both done it? I was hoping to. Oh, that's so funny.
Uh,
I need to get back to ICFA, but
yeah, extremely
these
nice people, extremely nice,
oh,
really
very
cool.
very
Yeah,
great event, and it's
yeah,
it's small, it's very personable. You'll run into authors that you've read books of that you love, and you're like, oh hey, whoa, you're here. How you doing?
yeah,
Great
yeah.
event. These covers though, let me tell
These
you.
guys.
So I'm gonna be honest with you. The very first time I saw the second one in where he's pulling a sword out and there's a lady with breast armor, which is so silly.
Yep.
I actually loved this before I knew anything about the series. Like, oh, interesting. But once you read Gardens of the Moon, you're like, who are these people? And
Yep.
I'm fairly certain Erickson either does not or would not like this cover very much
Yep.
because it's
And
everything he wasn't
that
doing.
that cover right there, that second one in, that was the one that was in the bookstore, and that actually stopped me from buying it for a little while,
Really?
because I thought it was a little too Harlequin romancy, you know? And
Yeah, I can see it.
I was just like, uh, you know, I really is so not for long, because the endorsement did it for me, but that's the one I got. That's the first version I got, and I loaned it to somebody and never got it back. So now I end up with this tower thing. But
I mean, I actually love that cover that you have there. I don't know why, but there's just something about it that is very like atmospheric. That kind of makes you wonder, like, what is that place? Like, what is in this book?
I
Um,
still am wondering, kind of like,
I
where
couldn't
is
tell.
that place? Yeah.
I couldn't tell you. I always just kind of assumed it like before, like I kind of understood what Moonspawn was. I was like, oh, it's probably like that Moonspawn thing. But like obviously it's not. Moonspawn, in fact, is in the bottom right corner.
The bottom
Um,
right, yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm not sure what the tower is, but I think the obvious answer is the Animander Rake cover from Subterranean Press. However, the
That's pretty
one
cool.
in the bottom right, bottom left, second in with the like lightning bolt thing
The
coming
lightning
out.
dude, yeah,
I
yeah,
really, really like this quite a bit. So a special edition with animated rake is hard to beat, but if I had to
yeah,
pick one that's more general, it would be that other one.
yeah. And the one on the bottom right that shows moon spawn,
Oh,
that's pretty cool. I like
Mark
that a lot.
Simonetti is the
Yeah.
artist behind that, and he is my favorite actually. Him and Waylon go head to head for my favorite fantasy artist.
Nice. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really, really, and that actually that looks like a scene in the book.
it does.
So
Yeah,
that's
it's a plus.
very cool. That's a plus. It's very cool cover. Yeah. All right. And so let me get off that. Yeah, there we go. All right. And so uh, without getting into details, why, besides the reasons we've already kind of went over, why should somebody read this book?
Well, honestly, I think it's for somebody who's one thing, something a little different. I mean, one, if you love Glenn Cook's Black Company, I'm not saying it's a one for one that you're going to love it because I actually do know a couple Black Company fans that did not enjoy Gardens of the Moon. However, I do think, that pipeline of Donaldson and Glenn Cook and Robert E. Howard, I think that does make a lot of sense. But for people who are just wanting more, people who are not afraid to jump around, have a little bit more psychic distance from the POVs, and just people that want something on a truly epic scale. I think being a fan of military fantasy obviously helps because of the Marines.
Sure.
But someone who isn't in a rush is also a great candidate for Malazan. Now, I'm a hypocrite because I read all 10 in 8 months, but that's because I
Wow.
have a problem. That's because I can, when I get into something, I hyperfixate. Like I just started golfing and it's ruining my life. Like I just
Oh,
can't stop
jeez.
golfing. So I hyperfixate on things. And so I'm not a good example. But if you're someone who really just wants to know what happens next, and you want to get your 20th book done for the month or whatever, like I don't know if this one's going to work. I would hope that it would stop you in your tracks and make you reevaluate, because I think that it has that kind of power behind it. But someone who's patient, someone who wants something truly epic, and someone who is willing to trust the process, I think that those are all candidates for this. Also, I think people, now this is maybe not the most popular opinion. I actually have said this before. I think that Malazan is a great intro read for someone new to the fantasy genre. Maybe not new to reading, okay? Maybe not new to reading, but new to the fantasy genre, because once you start reading fantasy and a lot of the stuff that you're going to see people recommend, it's all in the same vein. It's a little bit of the same approach, I would say, with little varying degrees. And then once you read Malazan, after that, Malazan feels like this really weird thing. And they're like, oh, well, like I thought it was going to be like I was in this person's head and then this person's head for 30 pages. And it's like, well, that's not how this is. So without any preconceived notions about what fantasy is or should be, I think that Malazan is a great place to start, because you free yourselves of these things. And
Yeah.
Personally, I think these are things that hold the genre back in a lot of ways. So I'll quote Philip Chase, because you can't do a Malazan discussion on YouTube without quoting Philip Chase anymore. He has a monopoly over good things to say about Malazan. But he said, for fans of literature, I would say great literature, I'd recommend. And I agree with Philip.
Yeah.
I think if you're a fan of literature, I think Malazan is that.
Yeah. No, you can see the influences outside of the fantasy genre on the story itself,
Mm-hmm.
on the writing style itself. Because I've read my fair share of classics, and I've even read some a little bit of like Vietnam War fiction and others genres that you see elements of a lot of good writing styles in
Yeah.
this series, and I think it's literature on the highest quality of like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of like details and techniques that he uses that um, certainly are from outside the genre, right? And are great, and not that uncommon as people make it sound. Like people act like Malazan's oh, who would ever write a book with this much distance from a POV? And it's like, well, actually, it happens all the time. It's actually very common if you
Yeah.
You just have to put down the dragon books for a little bit and explore. I'm not being pretentious. I love dragons, but I'm just saying you can get a whole wide range of experience in reading by reading Malazan that you wouldn't get usually in the fantasy genre, and you still get dragons. Like, that's awesome.
You do, actually, you do. um, and cool. So I want to bring up the very beginning here of the book itself. Right in the beginning, we have this this little epigraph to the whole series, where it says, "Now these ashes have grown cold. We open the old book. These oil-stained pages recount the tales of the fallen, a frayed empire, words without warmth. The hearth has ebbed, its gleam in life sparks are but memories against dimming eyes. What cast my mind? What hue my thoughts as I opened the book of the fallen and breathed deep the scent of history? Listen then to these words carried on that breath. These tales are the tales of us all, again, yet again. We are history relived, and that is all. Without end, that is all."
Yeah, what a banger opening, and there's so many things I love about this opening that I'm literally, I haven't done a close reading of this or anything, but just like what this does, one, obviously sets a tone clearly. However, it also has this really interesting passage of time as you go on, and you feel that you've now been told that you're going to hear about this long history of the fallen. Who are the fallen? What is this end that they are talking about? But actually, as it's going on, it's active. You're breathing in, and then on that breath, so there's actually, you can almost see yourself doing this with this big old oil stained book, and then you get that alliterate words without warmth, and then immediately we're told the hearth has ebbed, but then we talk about its gleam and life sparks, but the memories against dimming eyes. So we kind of get this idea of like it's burnt out, but think of sparks, thinks of gleaming, and then dimming eyes. What casts my mind? What hue? So color. You know what I mean? Like, there's a
Yeah.
whole lot of like whirlwind of imagery and symbolism here, and it actually does well represent Malazan. Malazan has times where you feel like all the hope has been drawn out, and it has ebbed, and that there are sparks of hope and gleam and color even. Actually, one of the things in Gardens of the Moon, I remember my review, I was like, I hope everything's not as dark. I feel like everything around me is dark, which is funny because Daruja Stan is blue, right, because of the gas.
Right. Good guess.
But
Yeah. The
there's
lights.
color to this thing, and history, and what does history mean, and how do we talk about history? How do we remember history? And it kind of sets you up to the fact that, hey, this is a book that someone has written, and
Yep.
lets you know that someone is telling you this story, which of course we know as we finish the series is a massively important piece of Malazan in itself. So this epigraph's doing a lot of heavy lifting in just maybe 10 lines, 12 lines
Yeah.
there.
And it's funny because you read this and it's like, oh, okay, cool poem. And the first time you're reading the book, it's cool poem, and you keep going, and then it's not until you go back to it that you go, oh wow,
Yeah.
the Book of the Fallen. Because when I first started reading this book, it's like the Tale of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I was like, oh, it's all about this Malazan Empire, but it's actually only partly true. It's
Mm.
about the fallen, and then the fallen doesn't necessarily. I always thought I would, because the first thing that came to my head was fall of the Roman Empire or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but it's actually not that. It's actually the fallen are, represent so many different things in this series,
Yeah.
and and plus just it's just poetic as well, and
Oh, yeah, it's amazing.
and especially that breathe deep the scent of history. So that indicates something so epic, and it just gives you that feeling that there's a lot going on before you even read the story going on in the book. That there's a lot going on already, and I
Yes.
love that about it.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of really good stuff in this too. Like the repetition, these tales are the tales of us all again, yet again. Like it's repetition about again and yet again. So talking about repetition. And also there's something powerful about to the words carried on that breath. And we think about what our soldiers carry in the story, right? Like they carry without any idea that they will ever be remembered or thought of at all, right? I don't know, and maybe I'm reaching on that one, but that kind of speaks to me on rereading this again. And you're right. Like you read this and you're like, okay, it's gonna be this big empire. We're gonna meet the king, and we're gonna do all these things. And then you open it up and you realize that it's a zoomed in, boots on the ground, which is what Glenn Cook did with Black Company, that Erikson loved so very much, and I dare say a more compelling story, a more human story, if you will, whenever you focus on those things. So there couldn't have been a more appropriate opening to the series and the book.
Yeah, and it brings a huge heft to those words "unwitnessed" that you later encounter.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Yep.
Awesome. So there we go. Getting into the nitty gritty. Let's move into that Siege of Pale. That when I first read the Siege of Pale, I was confused. I was like, what is going on here? There's a lot of stuff going on. There's things, magic flying all over the place, and there's people digging underground somewhere, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. So what is your impression of the Siege of Pale? And that, I think it's chapter 2, right?
Captivating, dude. I mean, just what in the world is going on? There's treachery afoot, it feels, and it's high magic. And at the time when I read this, I was reading back through my notes before this, we started this, and I was like, man, I was such a different person when I started this book. So I credit a lot of the progress of myself as a reader actually to Malazan, in more than one way. But one of those ways is understanding like fantasy is not just one thing, and it can impress you no matter what type of fantasy it is. And I was not a fan of high fantasy. Like, I wouldn't say I hated it, but like I definitely preferred low fantasy, right? And you open it up and then you're getting all the fireballs you could ever ask for, right? Lasers and fireballs, as Iskar used to say on YouTube. And I was shocked because one, all this stuff is happening, and I'm like wondering what's going on, but I'm also captivated by it. I'm in. Like, I'm like, okay, you know what? Maybe I can get really into a series that has high magic. That would be interesting. So for me, the confusion never felt bad. It felt like I was supposed to be asking questions, which is ironic because I think a lot of people ask questions in the text actually about what happened at Pale, because no one's really sure. And we only get it from the POVs that we see. Right. And we find out that in fact that this event is not just a linear event, but rather a spiral. And I am kind of stealing that from Erikson himself. He told me this whenever I did a video with him about Gardens of the Moon down at ICFA. And he talked about, afterwards, he talked about how events can be spirals. And like, you don't have to just do the event and then move on. But that event can be, kind of traced and tracked all around it. And depending on what side you are on, it's a totally different event. And the good guys could change and this and that. And when I started thinking about events and books like that, one, it kind of showed me a little bit how shallow some things can be in plot. And then it also made me have a great appreciation for everything that he does in Malazan, because a lot of it is, all of it is a spiral in many ways, even the series itself. So Pale, I don't know. I think it's the perfect opening for me. Plus, I really like sieges, if I'm being honest. Like, I'm a big fan. And then, like, Moonspawn's coming in. Like, what in the world is that thing? Who is Anamander Rake that demands such attention and reverence on the page? It's just like, woo, there's a lot of stuff being thrown at you. But I was overwhelmed, but in the best way possible.
Yeah. And all your expectations are subverted. We hear that a lot, on BookTube. But because you're right in the prologue, you're introduced to this character, Paran, and you think, oh, this is going to be our main character, and he's sitting in, he's a kid, he wants to be a soldier, and there is a little bit of full circle by the end of the book. He does he does say, "All right, now I'm a soldier," or whatever. But but then the rest of the series, he makes a few appearances here and there.
And I'm not gonna lie to you, man. The whole series, I was like, I want more Paran. I want more Paran and Tavor. Like
Yeah,
those were the two that I latched on to probably the most.
yeah, and you're like, "Where is he?"
Yeah,
But
please show
but
up.
you're getting all this tons of other super interesting stuff, and you're like, "Okay, where is he?" But this is cool as hell,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and it does kind of throw you a little bit of a curveball. I've actually had people who have started out Guardsmen, they really like it, and then they get into part 2 or part 3, and it starts to go away from Paran and Tattersall, and they're like, "Wait, whoa, whoa, no, 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 I want to come back to these people," and I'm like, "Oh, you're in for it. You need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because this is
Yeah,
going to be a ride for you."
yeah, yeah, you're right, and it's the Siege of Pale that, it made me realize that I was okay with not knowing everything going on.
Yes,
This
yes,
book made me realize that because most of the time, you're reading a book and you're like, "Oh, okay, this happened. Alright, cool. Now I'm moving on to the next part, and this
hmm,
happened." And you're like, "Okay." And then, every once in a while, I get thrown a curveball. "Oh, it was actually like this. Okay." And a lot of books do that. But
hmm.
this one is you just don't know what's going on, and you have to be okay with that in order to enjoy the series and keep moving forward, because otherwise you could drive yourself nuts
Oh yeah.
having all these questions that aren't going to be answered or aren't going to be answered in the way you think they are.
Yeah, a bit of
And
analysis paralysis, as they say. You're
mm,
trying to analyze this thing and figure out exactly what you're supposed to know, but when in reality, you're supposed to ask that question and then move on for the answer. And the answer might not come from many books, possibly. So you got to just kind of, like I said, have faith in the process. But the Siege of Pale also does a really great job. Everyone always talks about the media res and like, oh, you just get dropped in and you're going to drown. And to a certain point, that is true. But also, what it really means, far more than just some device to confuse you or whatever, it's to show you that this world is living and breathing and has been going on without you, and that you are
that's correct.
now in a POV. And we should ask ourselves, why did this story that someone's telling us start here? Why is this? Why are these the opening scenes of the series? It's a good question to ask. Now, I would say with retrospect, that's an easier question to ask when you know everything, right?
Yeah,
But it's the sense that this world has existed, things have happening or have been happening, and you get the exact same feeling once you get to Darujistan. You have all of the politics of this city that is trying to stay free of the empire, and some people think that they should give up so it can be peaceful. Some people don't want to do that at all. And Amanda Rake's meeting with the real leader. You have an eel going around, and you're like, there's a lot of moving parts, but of
hmm,
course there are, because this is a real city trying to continue to be its own, right? So
yeah,
that's also something that the Siege of Pale does extremely well. Like, I've seen some criticisms. People are like, well, there's this big betrayal at the Siege of Pale, and why should I care? Because I don't know these characters. And it's like, buddy, buddy, go back, just go back to Choose Your Own Adventures or something. I'm being a little mean, but like that, is that really why we read? Like, shouldn't we read because we want to find out more? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. To me, it seems obvious on the face that, like, yes, there is some treachery afoot, and we should want to know why it happened. We don't have to be emotionally destroyed by it at the beginning, but we should be curious of what's led to these events. Why does this person think this is something that they should have done, and who gave these orders? Dang it, I need to know.
mm,
These questions are all answered.
yeah, right. And you brought up a good point earlier about you're rereading this right now, but you're taking your time and you're doing it
Yeah,
for yourself. And I think that was a big key for me to when I first read this the first time, and I was like, all right, slow down and
mhm,
enjoy this for
yeah,
what it is as you're reading it, instead of just getting the book done and moving on to the next one. Because it was, it's a 10-book series. You're like, oh, cool. Oh, great. I'm two down, eight to go,
yeah,
and, um, but this series, I think, invites you to just enjoy actually what you're reading now
yeah,
instead of worrying about where you're going to be standing a year from now, in
yeah.
the series. and that's part of what I love about it. And the and you said it, the opening epigraph we just read actually tells you what you said earlier about uh, that there's stuff going on. This world has already existed when you're
Mhm.
thrown into this siege of Pale.
Yeah.
So it's already existed. This all this history's already gone on. It's just like being born today. The world has
Beautiful way to
gone
put
on
it.
before you were born, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to learn as you grow up.
Yeah,
And so,
and it will go on hopefully after you as well.
yeah,
And
most
and
likely.
yeah, and that's that's a great way of putting that actually. I love that.
Yeah, and so that's just part of the charm for me of
Yeah.
even more as we pile on the charm for these books. But uh, and another thing about this book, this Gardens of the Moon book, which um, is amazing once you look back at it. All these little tiny hints in here
Oh, yeah.
about about the future that
Oh, dude. Yeah, there's something where, like, Kroll is talking about, like, the Tilana Mass, and she will lead them, and this is a battle that I'm gonna lose, and I'm like, "Wow, that was obvious." Like, how did I not see this at all? Or just, like,
right,
little things, like,
yeah,
even in book, right? Even the in-book mysteries, like, it's obvious that Krupp is the eel. Like, it's very obvious. And I actually did pick up on that, I think, by like part 3. I think whenever they call him Slippery, I'm like, oh, okay, this is the
yeah,
eel, you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
But for some people, that's a huge revelation. They're like, what?
It is because it's easy to miss. There's a lot going on even in just
Yeah.
he breaks it up into sections, and
Hmm.
those sections read like almost little short stories unto themselves,
Yes. Yes.
and there's a lot going on just in that little short story.
I
And then
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
yeah,
I
and
I
then
think
so
actually sorry, go ahead.
no, but
I'm
so it's
excited.
easy to miss from one short story to the next. It's easy to miss that information that
Absolutely.
was in the last one because the next short story is so interesting.
Yeah, and that's the difference, right? Between it just being a bunch of short stories is that there is a through line, right?
Yes.
And that there is continuity between these things. So that's what makes it special. But I think, reading this series, and now I've been reading a lot more short fiction. I actually love short fiction. I've become like kind of obsessed with it in some ways. But like reading like Chekhov, right? Or Tolstoy or whoever else, you realize that those stories, those little tiny stories, they are packed
Packed. Yeah.
packed line by line with stuff. And it just so happens that Erickson did that with with 10 very big books.
With
He said
4,000,000 words or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, every line is going to just be an absolute slammer and you're going to have to pay attention. And of course you're going to miss stuff. But like
Yeah.
will by the time you end it, will you have an idea of what you read? Yeah, of course. I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, like I expect to miss stuff now. I'm on my
Mhm.
second read through, and I'm up to the Cripple God right now.
Oh wow, so
Um,
you're woo.
and I was looking back through this book today that, before we started, and I'm like, already picked up stuff I missed on my second read through. So I'm just like, oh, wow, the demon actually told us when he was fighting Rake that Rake is actually more dragon than Tice Dandy. He actually tells
Yeah.
us that. And
Yeah.
it's like, "Oh, I missed that twice."
Hey, I'll tell you what, and I'm a hypocrite because I don't reread a lot. I've never been a big rereader, big rewatcher of TV shows. It's just not my thing. I don't know why. However, there are fair whenever I do, it means it's something special to
Something
me, right?
special, yeah.
And I've read A Song of Ice and Fire 7 times, I think.
Wow.
And every time I have read it, literally every single time, there's stuff I've missed. There's stuff I've missed. And if I miss stuff in there, of course I've missed stuff in Malazan. Of course I missed stuff in the Second Apocalypse. So, you know, I've seen some people say, well, you have to reread Malazan to truly, to get the experience. And I don't think that's true. But I
No,
do think you're going to get a new experience. Like you're going to get
a
a
new
better
experience.
experience.
That's what it is,
And
yeah.
I think Erickson took a lot of pride, and he might even said this. I always try to be wary of like remembering quotes, but when I talk to him, I feel like I remember him saying that he took pride in the fact that like the books are very good value for what they are, like for how much you're paying for them,
Sure.
because like you can sit there. with just Midnight Tides. Just Midnight Tides, because it's kind of capsule. You could sit there and read Midnight Tides 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times and probably get something out of it different every single time. And how much did you pick up the book? $10, $20. That's a lot of time and personal enjoyment. Not to mention maybe possibly even some growth as a reader and person for that money. And I think that for the money, Malazan is most likely the best value that you could ever have. If you only had a certain amount of money to spend on books for your whole life, I would say, well, you should probably pick up Malazan. It's a good idea.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could always go Shakespeare or something, but
he was kind of important.
Malazan has dragons, so
yeah, and much cooler. Did you know Shakespeare invented the word elbow?
Really?
What a great word.
What a piece of trivia that is.
Like elbow has like this, just like our elbow. Like, I don't know. Sorry. I've been reading a lot about Shakespeare lately because I've been reading Harold Bloom, who is obsessed with him. So
cool.
Ignore me.
And so another thing about this book is look at the characters, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get the sense that there's no mustache twirling villains here. They're all pretty well people for the most part. You got your jagged tyrant and all that stuff, but you get a sense that the people in here are trying to do the right thing in their situation rather than purposely just being bad guys for the sake of being bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what hit me as you're getting all these different points of view. That when you change the point of view, you're getting that person's point of view, like, oh, I'm doing this because of this. And then of course it gets changed around to Darudistan, from Malazans, and they're all like, well, I'm doing this because of this. And I just love how he incorporates that into the story as, who do you root for?
Oh yeah, it's very conflicting. I mean, look at Crocus. I mean, Crocus breaks into a woman's bed while she's sleeping and steals. And at first I was like, this is weird and a creep, but then you start to see him interacting with Krupp and other people, and they're talking about the boy becoming a man. And also he has this coin from Opon, which, if you can pick up on it, is definitely an influence on him. And it's just like, okay, well, maybe he's not all to blame for this. Like what are the other factors about this person? And he has this big liberating moment at the end, kind of a free will discussion, I guess, a little bit, because I'm thinking of like the gods wanting to manipulate Opon's coin, and at the end of the book he throws the coin, which I was very shocked by as a reader. I'm not gonna lie to you. I remember the first time I read it, I was like, oh, like I thought this was going to be like Opon's agent the whole time through. Like that's what I really thought. And I thought that he was going to, like, maybe, this is where my brain went. I remember I thought that he might somehow flip the script and then be able to, like, take Opon's seat or something, because I wasn't sure how all the ascension stuff worked. Like, I was very confused.
Sure.
But I was thinking that Crocus was going to climb. That's not at all it. He actually ends up having this moment of agency where he throws this coin and is now born again, almost. Maybe not in such an intense term, but like a new phase of his life begins, maybe becoming the man out of the boy, possibly even. So Crocus is a great example of that. And then of course Tattersail is trying to figure out what in the world is going on. She's following commands. She's part of kind of the same issue or order of people as Taishran, and is trying to figure out, did Taishran really do these terrible things? Why are the bridge burners being exiled? So you immediately get the sense that there's a lot more going on than just like, we're the Empire, we're here to siege. There's a whole bunch more going on. And it's hard to pick out who to root for. I would say the only person that I personally did like hate at the beginning was Taishran, just because I immediately like love the bridge burners. But even Taishran is more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he doesn't give you much to go on in this book away to not hate Taishran. But of course, we get a lot more later on in the series. where things aren't always as they seem. Um, you know, just like in real life, really. That
Yeah.
there's always circumstances on all sides.
Yeah, I mean, you could even, I mean, if you really wanted to get down to it with the Crocus stuff, like you could, and by the way, Crocus isn't like super hateable, but he was just a little off-putting to me at first. It's not like he was doing horrible, horrible things, but he is a thief, right? I mean, that's
He's a
not
thief.
the most moral thing in the world. And going into a girl's room while she's sleep, kind of weird, but you could almost get into the whole like there's a lot of talk about like determinism and stuff nowadays, right? And how
Mhm.
much of free will do we have or whatever. But whether or not that's real, I don't necessarily care, to be honest. But the interesting thing about that is that a lot of people think that is a vehicle to have more empathy, because you're realizing that these people are making these decisions because of the way they are, I'm going to say, wired, in a very simple term. But
Yeah.
um, in some ways, I could see that kind of being played out. Like, well, maybe you should have all these factors. Maybe not so much determinism, but like you should have all these factors before you damn somebody, right? You should try to extend yourself past the initial POV that you get and see all sides of this thing, and maybe possibly you could arrive at a more empathetic position about them.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. Tatasale was trying to figure all this out, and she's asking all these questions, like, "All right, who's pulling our strings? Who's
Hmm.
which god is it? Is Opon pulling our strings? Is it Shadow Throne? Is it
Yeah,
his assassin, the rope? And they keep. She's asking all these questions, and it's interesting because you get introduced to this deck of dragons. Uh,
yeah,
you know, scrying mechanic or whatever it is, and that throws like a lot of chaos into what the characters are trying to figure out.
hmm,
Because it's has that veneer of prophecy and stuff like that. Um, but it's also a little bit more immediate than what's going to happen in the future. It's like what's happening now, basically,
hmm,
and so that was a really cool thing that Erickson introduced. That what I love about it is it also changes as the story goes.
mm,
As the situation in the world changes, so does the means of trying to figure out through the deck of dragons what is going on in the world. And
yeah.
I just love how he does that.
Yeah, and the Deck of Dragons are scenes that I've went back and reread, and I still don't fully. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the series I still don't understand. But guess what? I had a great time. I got tons out of it, and I understand the overall arcing story, which is what people worry about. I think. Like, do you understand what an Azeth house is still? Like, I still don't really. Or what is it? The
I
Finist or something? What is the thing?
The
The
finesse.
I,
I think
I don't
those
know what.
yeah. See, I can only say I think it is because I'm not 100% sure, but I think those are like the seeds of the Azath houses or that what
Yeah, yeah.
you
And I
know, eh,
wonder, like, well, where does that come from? You know what I mean? It starts this chain of things where I'm like, I don't know. And I've still to this day still don't
yeah.
understand
And
Haboric, like any of the Jade stuff with Haboric later on. I'm like,
Jade's yeah, well, I just read that in the Cripple God,
gosh.
where they give you he gives you a little clue in book 10, just so you know, people. But
It's where I
uh,
felt like my brain was melting and pouring out of my
it's
nose when I was
it,
reading.
yeah, and it's so fun,
Oh
and
yeah.
and and then you throw in the Esselmont books, and he throws in all these little clues too, and it's just so much fun to put it together because like I'm seeing I'm way on in the Cripple God in Dust of Dreams. I'm seeing little references to Esselmont's books in those books,
Mm,
and it
mm.
goes back and forth, and it's just like, oh wow, it's incredible.
Yeah, knowing that, so I've only read one Esselman book. I do plan on reading more of them, but knowing that there's even more to Malazan is amazing, but also super daunting because I'm like, oh no,
Yeah,
like, do I need? What I most likely will do is probably do like that ultimate reread, where like you read between them,
yeah,
right? Like
that's
you do.
that's
I
what I'm
think,
doing. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I think that that makes sense for me.
it
Also,
does. Yeah,
on a reread, the pressure isn't there, of course, to like
pressure's not there.
get
Yeah,
through them. Like you can kind of just enjoy it. But I read Night of Night. I need to read Return of the Crimson Guard next. It's just a really thick.
It's
thick book.
pretty big, yeah.
Yeah, and I've been on that short fiction kick, so
Yeah.
I got to get out of it.
All right, Jimmy. Well, we're gonna wrap this up here. Any final words specifically about Gardens of the Moon that
Well,
we should
I just
let our viewers know?
I think it's a little underrated, in my opinion, in my stupid opinion. What does that really mean? I'm not sure, but to me, it just feels like I see Gardens of the Moon, like when people tier rank the series or rank it, it's usually towards the bottom. But in some ways, there's aspects of it that are my favorite, like the Siege of Pale, like Tattersall, like Paran being a boy, and then we see him as a man and realize that the 4 warnings were true, and he's realizing that being a soldier wasn't the best, maybe career path, and getting introduced to Amanda Rake, who goes to this dance and wears a mask and thinks people are going to realize it's him, which is just absolutely like, that's another thing. This book is funny. Like, it's really funny.
Yeah.
There's so many good moments of comedy in Malazan. I don't know. I just think it's such a tone setter, and the series does become bigger and better and has more scope than you could ever imagine by just reading Gardens of the Moon. But whenever you come back to it at the end, it's hard to say that it's not one of the more satisfying experiences is coming back to Gardens of the Moon. Gardens of the Moon is almost like a dessert once you finish Crippled God. So if you haven't reread Gardens of the Moon, you finish the series, you should for dessert, get a little creme brulee, get a little Gardens of the Moon,
There you go. You brought up a great point about the humor too.
Oh gosh.
Because I got to tell you, the first time I finished with Crippled God, and I'm crying, I got tissues, right? And all I can remember was a lot of the tragedy that happens throughout the series.
And there's a lot.
And I go back and I'm rereading, and especially like Dust of Dreams. That's what I remembered. It was the tragedy in Dust of Dreams. Yeah. But I go back and I reread, and I'm like, oh, wow, there's a lot of funny stuff in here.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot. There's a lot of humor, a whole bunch. And so it would be good for people to realize that it's not all heavy. There's actually, you remember the heavy stuff because it's big and epic and tragic, but there's a lot of humor in these books as well. There's a lot of other stuff.
That's right. There's a lot of humor, but there's also a sense of friendship that is extremely authentic. And it doesn't surprise you when you know that this was born of a friendship between Esselman and Erikson. And it shines through because this has the best duos of all time.
That is true. And that is an excellent point. I like that. I like that a lot. And on that note, we will bid you guys adieu. Jimmy, thanks so much once again for coming on to Book Think number 11.
Hey, literally anytime.
Awesome. Thank you. And for all you watching, please go visit Jimmy's channel, the Fantasy Nuttwork. I'll put the link down below. And check out all his stuff because it's all fascinating. All right. And as I always say, be good to each other. And
Absolutely.
thanks.